those areas. She's widely published on lots of aspects of Viking Age culture across the north, and is also a really skilled public speaker. You may have seen her in various podcasts or giving lectures a little bit like today. Today we're really lucky that she's going to be speaking to us. The title you see on the screen here, "The Personal is Political, Untangling the Connections to 1066. Over to you, Pragya.
Kind and generous, and probably not as deserved as we would think. But thank you everyone for being here. As Annie said, I am an historian of migration and diaspora, and I have a particular interest in the way in which kinship sits alongside these movements. And so I'm going to be boring you with details of how people are related to each other. That's my purpose today. But hopefully there's a point to the boredom. And if you start getting a bit lost with lots of different names, particularly lots of the same name, trust me, it'll all come together at the end. So I've rather shamelessly borrowed this slogan from second wave feminism, "The personal is political," mostly because it served my purpose today to highlight the interlinking of power and personal relationships that lead to the events of 1066. But it also serves, I think, to demonstrate, I think, the spirit of the original slogan, which is that what happens in political spheres has an impact on personal lives, even when we think perhaps it doesn't. And so, by the end of this talk, I'm hoping that you'll be able to see just how closely the personal and the political are connected to each other. So, we've got 1066, the seminal year, as Andy said, and it is the year of the three battles. These three battles represent three competing claims to the English throne. The first one from the sitting king, Harold Godwinson, the second from Harald Hardrada, the king of Norway, and his ally, Tosti Godwinson. There is a connection between them, which we will come to. And the third from William, the Duke of Normandy. What we will see, hopefully, by the end of these 40 minutes, is that all of these three claimants were intricately connected to one another through a network of interpersonal relations that go back to the reign of King Canute, beginning in 1016. But I'm going to take you a little bit further back than that, so bear with me. I think to understand what happens in 1066, we need to go very briefly back to what is considered the beginning of the Viking Age in England or in Britain. And it's this event. It's the raid on the monastic community at Lindisfarne on the Northumbrian coast in 793. We have plenty of evidence to suggest that there was contact between Britain and Scandinavia before this date, but this is when our sources, our written sources, really start paying attention to Scandinavians. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, which is the main recorded history from this time, gives us wonderful supernatural portents, comets in the sky, dragons, all sorts of wonderful things that herald the arrival of these Viking raiders. And in the aftermath of this raid, we have contemporaries like Alcuin of York who describe what the raid was like. So Alcuin says, "The pagans have desecrated God's sanctuary, shed the blood of saints around the altar, laid waste the house of our Lord, and trampled the bodies of the saints like dung in the street. It's very visceral, this description, it's very evocative. Alcuin wasn't anywhere near Lindisfarne when he wrote this. He wasn't anywhere near Lindisfarne when the raid happened. He was happily sitting in Aachen, comfortable in the court of Charlemagne at the time of the events. But his writing reflects what becomes the established convention regarding the Viking presence in Britain. Less than a century after this horrific raid, in 865, the Viking Great Heathen Army arrives on the shores of Britain. And what this does is it extends the violence and the terror that had previously been confined to isolated coastal monastic communities into the political heartlands of Britain. So now everyone is affected, basically. And this army doesn't just carry out some raids of the kind of Lindisfarne experience. It doesn't just grab and run. It overwinters. It stays over in the territories that it has managed to gain control over, including York in 866. The Great Heathen Army comes to York and takes the city. For the longest time, the nature of the Great Heathen Army had been debated. And new excavations, however, from overwintering sites like Torksey in Lincolnshire have served to reveal the size, the scale and the nature of this Great Heathen Army. When the source says Great Heathen Army, you expect big, burly men who are going out fighting. That's the image that it conjures. Not quite so. So what you have here is an artist's reconstruction of what the winter camp at Torksey may have looked like. And as you can see, it's absolutely massive. This is not just a militia. This is, from what it looks like a city on the move. And the finds, the objects that archaeologists have found in these sites has revealed that it contained not just combatants, not just people who would go out and fight and kill, but non-combatants, women, children, craftsmen, metal workers, moneyers who minted the coins that Andy is interested in. There's all kinds of activity, economic, social, cultural activity going on in these camps that you would expect in urban sites. Oh, sorry. I haven't decided to go to sleep. And so what these excavations show us is that not only are our contemporary annals not exaggerating the numbers, they're also giving us a slightly different perspective, that Andy talked about. So it should be no surprise then, given the nature of what we know about this Great Heathen Army, it should be no surprise then that in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle we start getting records of parts of the army settling down. So this rather blurry little picture here is from the Parker Chronicle version of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. I'm sorry, I know you can't read it, but what it says is that Halfdan, one of the leaders of the Great Heathen Army, brings his half of the army up north to Northumbria, and they begin to settle in Northumbria. They divide up the lands in Northumbria and start to settle here. So this kind of settlement of Scandinavians is visible in many different ways in the historical record. So if we look, for instance, at place names recorded in that 1086 Domesday book that Andy mentioned earlier, we find that there's a density of place names derived from the Scandinavian language, Old Norse, In the northern parts of the island, you can see where the sort of line is drawn and the way in which the distribution works on this map. And this reflects the levels of Scandinavian migration and settlement that are taking place in the Viking Age. This northern distribution of place names correlates rather neatly with the distribution of another form of evidence, which is the Scandinavian-influenced sculpture in the form of hogback stones. Now, these are really mysterious objects. We're not entirely certain what they're meant to be, but they're a very distinctive kind of sculpture that emerge out of Scandinavian settlement among Anglo-Saxon communities. They're not found anywhere else in the Viking world. They're only found in this context. There's other evidence for the impact of Scandinavian migration and settlement in the 9th, 10th, 11th centuries. Perhaps the most easily accessible to us is the impact on the language that we speak, English. So if you had an egg this morning for breakfast, you have the Vikings to thank for it because they gave English the word egg. If you looked up at the sky and thought it was blue, well, you got the word sky from Old Norse as well. If you had a run-in with the law, perhaps this morning, the law too, that word law too, comes to us from Old Norse. So there's huge amounts of cultural impact of the arrival of the Vikings on the society and culture of the island. And this developed and intensified over nearly 3 centuries of migration and settlement. But what we find is that the scale of change that we see on the social and cultural life of the island, all of the things that we've just talked about, they're not necessarily reflected in the political sphere of human interaction. So we've got a number of Scandinavian rulers in the historical record, and particularly those associated with the Viking Kingdom of York. But there's no established dynastic power similar to the dynasty that's established by Alfred of Wessex and his descendants. Now, I'm not suggesting that there are no individuals of Scandinavian origin and descent in the political sphere, active in politics of the time or holding political power in these earlier centuries of Scandinavian settlement. So just a few examples. We do have people like Odda, who is the Archbishop of Canterbury, who serves under the kings Athelstan and Edmund, and we're told that Odda was most likely the child of parents who had participated in the activities of the Great Heathen Army. Another 10th century, mid-10th century churchman is Oscattel, who becomes Bishop of Dorchester and Archbishop of York, serving under the kings Edred, Edwy and Edgar. And again, Oscattel himself is of Scandinavian extraction. Beyond the church, we have secular leaders as well. Just as an example, we've got Oslak, whose name most likely is the Old Norse Ausloikur. And he is recorded as the eldest of York, which basically means he had control of pretty much all of what is currently Northumbria and Cumbria. So he's not an insignificant figure. He's quite powerful. And he's powerful in that he's mentioned in one of the law codes of King Edgar. So this is a law code that is issued to the entire kingdom, and it mentions this guy. So he must clearly be important. Oslak attests a number of Edgar's charters and documents, and he also appears in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. At one point he is exiled, and the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle is rather sad in the way in which it records his exile, which is unusual for the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. It doesn't usually go into sentiment, but it did in the case of Onslaught. So we've got a few of these individuals, few and far between, who are of Scandinavian extraction but are involved in the politics of the nascent English kingdom, the kingdom that is slowly becoming England as we know it today. But it's only with the arrival of Sven Forkbeard and his son Knut, who are generally known as England's Viking kings, that we start to see Scandinavians systematically included in the governance of the kingdom at the highest levels. So how does this come about? Very briefly, we have a resurgence of Viking raids in the 990s, and some of these big raids were led by a prince of Denmark called Sven Forkbeard, who is the son of Harold Bluetooth. And yes, if you're thinking about young mobile phones and Bluetooth, it is named for this chap. Who claims to be the first king of a consolidated kingdom of Denmark. In 1013, Sven and his son launched an expedition, which resulted in the Anglo-Saxon king Ethelred being driven into exile. Ethelred runs away to Normandy, and we'll come to why he goes to Normandy. And Sven is recognised as the King of England. Sven's reign in England, unfortunately, is only 5 weeks long. Yeah, it's one thing to conquer a kingdom, it's another to hold on to it. So, on February 3rd, 1014, Sven died. And this led to something of a succession crisis, and this is kind of going to be a theme in what I'm talking to you about for the rest of this talk. Some of the nobility accepted his son Knut as king, but others invited Ethelred back from exile. Ethelred was successful, he chased the young Knut out, but that's not the end of the story. In 1015, Knut comes back with renewed vigour and more men, probably. And what we get is several small and large battles, all of which are recorded in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, which trouble Ethelred and his son and heir, Edmund Ironside. The aging King Ethelred dies in 1016, and in the conflict that follows, Edmund Ironside and Knut both kind of decide to cut their losses and put an end to the fighting by agreeing a division of the kingdom. Knut can have the north, Edmund's going to have the south, everyone's happy. But there's a succession clause. Whoever survives the other would rule over the entirety of the kingdom. You can guess what happens next. By November 1016, Edmund is dead, and Knut has the entirety of the kingdom. Now, again, he's got it, he has to hold it. So, Knut's reign in England begins with 2 key steps that are meant to consolidate his power, meant to turn him from an invader into a functioning ruler. The first step was marriage. Knut marries Ethelred's widow, Queen Emma. Now this is a really significant move because it allows Knut to enter into the court, the already established court politics of the kingdom that he's just taken over, through Emma, who is already quite well connected. But there's more to Emma than meets the eye. And that is where, I'm sorry, this is the first of many genealogical tables that you're going to see today. Emma of Normandy was the daughter of Richard I of Normandy, who himself is the grandson of the Viking Hrolf, who was granted the dukedom of Normandy by Charles the Simple. Emma's mother is Gunnar, who, according to one of our sources, Duke of St. Quentin, was of noble Danish descent. So she's a catch, really. She belongs to the royal house of Normandy. It gets better. Richard I was a long-standing ally of Harold Bluetooth, we've heard of him before, and his son, Sven Forkbeard. So Emma and Knut's marriage was strategically a very sensible move. And you'd think, right, that's brilliant. However, we've got offspring, and we will come to the issue of those offspring with Ethelred in a minute. We have another problem in that Knut was previously married. He is married to an Anglo-Saxon noblewoman called Elfrifu of Northampton, with whom he had 2 sons, Sven and Harold Harefoot. Knut puts aside this first wife in order to marry Emma, and according to the Encomium, which is another chronicle that was created under Emma's patronage after Knut's death, they had an agreement between them. Only his children with her could succeed to the throne of England. So what this agreement does then is it removes from the line of succession not just Knut's children with Elfrifu, but these children, Emma's children with Ethelred. These children are in exile in Normandy, and they remain in exile in Normandy for most of, in fact, all of Knut's reign, with perhaps the occasional trip over the channel just to say hi to their mum. But it did happen. They did come over to say hi. That leads to disaster, which I will come to. Family drama, that's what this is. Knut's sons with Elfrifu, Sven and Harold, play quite a significant role in Knut's expansion in Scandinavia. So as Knut is expanding into Scandinavia, becoming King of Denmark, and then King of Norway, and then King of part of Sweden, these sons are playing a part with their father, and they're holding power as his regents in these areas. In fact, Old Norse sources refer to Sven's regency in Norway with reference to his mother. So the time that Sven and Elfrifu spend in Norway is known in Old Norse sources as Alfifuöld, the time of Alfifa. And I'll tell you why. Because it's horrible regency. The people are miserable, they are heavily taxed, there's famine, they're not happy with the rulers that have been set over them. But did they complain about it being Sven's time? No, they went for the woman. Just saying. And we will come back to the ramifications of this particular regency in a bit. The second step that Knut takes is a reorganization of power within his English kingdom. And what this sees, what this move does, is it removes several existing Anglo-Saxon elites and creates new ones. So some of the major earldoms in the kingdom go as prizes to his Scandinavian followers, and so we can see that here. Northumbria goes to Eric of Ladir, who is a Norwegian. East Anglia goes to Thorkell the Tall, who is one of his Danish followers. But Mercia stays in the hands first of Edric Spriona until he gets his head chopped off because he annoys Knut, and then goes to the long-standing Anglo-Saxon family of Leofwine, and his son Leofrich then succeeds his father. Wessex, the prize, the heartland of the kingdom, stays initially with Canute, but then we see the creation of Godwinner as an important Earl of Wessex. Godwinner is a newly raised Earl. He doesn't really belong to a long-standing Anglo-Saxon family, but this mix of Scandinavian and Anglo-Saxon that you see here is reflected in the witness lists of the charters that are being signed during Canute's reign. So again, I'm sorry, I realise that you can't really read the names here, but you're going to have to take my word for it. They're all mixed up, and they're half Anglo-Saxon and half Scandinavian. Godwinner is perhaps the most interesting of these new elites. His lineage is a bit uncertain, but he rises rapidly to the status of being the king's most trusted man. Between 1019 and 1023, he accompanies Canute on expeditions to Denmark, he distinguishes himself, and he gets himself a wife. Oh, sorry, wrong one. A wife, who is the sister of Jarl Ulf, who happens to be Canute's regent in Denmark. Canute can't be everywhere at once, so he's sitting in England. Ulf is handling his Danish affairs, and Ulf himself is married to Canute's sister Estrid. So Godwinner is married at one remove into the royal line of Canute. Godwinner plays a key role in several of the events during Canute's reign, as well as the reigns of his successors, and many of his sons, he's got quite a number of them, find themselves in positions of power after the older earls put in place by Canute started dying out in the mid-11th century. So Canute's long and quite stable reign gave rise to Europe-wide interpersonal links between the elites of England and those of the continent. And while these kinship networks and power dynamics flourish in times of political stability, like the reign of Canute, they have started to become liabilities when we have succession crises. And as I said before, we're going to have a few of them. Now, Canute dies in 1036. We have a clear successor. We have his sons. Any of his three sons could have taken the throne of England, but there's only one that keeps the deal with Emma. Arthur Canute is the only successor that keeps the deal with Emma going. Sven, unfortunately, this is Sven here, predeceases his father, so he's kind of out of the picture. After his disastrous regency in Norway, he and his mother are thrown out, and Sven dies in 1035. Canute's son, Arthur Canute, is sent to Norway to deal with the Norwegian problem, but this unfortunately coincides with Canute's death in 1036. So, while Arthur Canute is in Norway, Harold takes the throne of England. Norway comes under the rulership of the dynasty of Saint Olaf, and that's Olaf Haraldsson, and it's Magnus the Good who is on the throne of Norway while Arthur Canute is dealing with this problem. Like previous kings, Harold dies after only 3 years. By 1040, Harold Harefoot is dead. Arthur Canute has to return to England to take his throne. And so he leaves Denmark in the hands of his cousin, sorry, we're going to go back and forth, this guy, Sven Estridsson, the son of Canute's sister in Denmark. So the Danish throne goes to Sven Estridsson. Now we have some sources that suggest that before leaving Denmark, Harthacnut made a deal with Magnus, this chap. And the deal was similar to the ones we've seen before. Norway and Denmark belong to two separate people. Magnus has Norway, Sven has Denmark, but on the death of whichever one comes first, the other inherits the entire kingdom. Now, it's unclear from this deal whether Harthacnut intended for this agreement to apply to his English kingdom as well as his Danish kingdom. But that's clearly the way the Norwegians understood it. So Sven Estridsson and Magnus continue to have a bit of a tussle until this chap shows up. Magnus's half-uncle, Harald Hardrada. In 1047, Magnus dies and he divides his claims between Harald in Norway and Sven in Denmark. But as his nephew's successor, Harald realizes that he has a claim to the English throne. And so when, in 1066, Tosti Godwinson comes knocking, looking for an ally, Harald says, "Oh yes, I have a claim too. Let's do this." We're going to move back in time, however, and we're going to go back to what's happening after Knut's death. So we've seen the death of Sven Knutson, we've seen the deal between Harthacnut and Magnus, and Knut's death. And Harald Harefoot has died as well. In the middle of all of this, we have the sons of Emma with Ethelred, who are still knocking around. They're still in Normandy, they're still there, they still have a claim to the throne. In 1036, during one of those trips to meet Mum, Alfred Etheling, the older one, is murdered. He's captured, his eyes are put out, and he's killed. Some sources suggest that it was Godwinna who's the instigator of this attack, removing a contender from the throne. Some suggest that it was Emma herself who did it. Whichever way it panned out, with the death of Harthacnut in 1042, Emma's last surviving son, Edward the Confessor, comes to the English throne. And that's where we get our first connection with the Bayeux Tapestry, because it's this Edward that is sort of portrayed on the Bayeux Tapestry. We have a further entangling of the connections between these families, as if it wasn't confusing enough. We have a further entangling, because Edward marries Edith of Wessex, who happens to be the daughter of Godwinna, the Earl of Wessex. This relationship brings the line of Godwinna into close contention for the English throne. Now, just to make matters even better, Edith and Edward did not have any children. So the problem of succession to the English throne raises its ugly head once again when Edward becomes ill in 1065. At the same time as Edward is ailing, there's an upheaval among the earls of the kingdom. The succession to the earldom of Northumbria has become contentious, and Tosti, this chap, also a son of Godwinna, thinks that he should have it. He should be Earl of Northumbria. Harold Godwinson, son of Godwin, by this point held large swathes of land in England and was one of the most powerful earls in the kingdom. And he is unhappy with the idea of Tosti getting Northumbria. It's a fraternal spat, basically. But what that results in is Edward being convinced to send Tosti into exile. Where does Tosti go when he goes to exile? Well, he first goes to William of Normandy saying, "Hey, will you help me?" William says, "Thank you very much, no." But then Tosti finds a willing ally in Harald Hardrada in Norway, and they start hatching their plans. The life of King Edward, the Vita Edwardi, tells us that Edward, when he got sick, left his kingdom and his widow to, and I quote, Harold Godwinson's protection. That seems to suggest that what follows after Edward's death, which is in 1066, that the English elites have a reason to crown Harold Godwinson as the King of England. But there's another claimant. There's another one, and the one who would eventually win. And that is, that is William of Normandy. Now, William, as you can see here, is the great nephew of our wonderful matriarch, Emma of Normandy, and it's through her that he lays claim to the throne of his English cousin, Edward. We also have the additional layer of fun in several Norman sources, all written after the conquest, claiming that Edward had actually promised the throne to Normandy. He had promised William he would be his successor while Edward was still in exile in Normandy. Now, all of these competing claims come crashing together in the battles of 1066. Tosti and Harold Hardrada come together and invade Northumbria, not far from, well, actually not far from where we are standing right now. It's the Battle of Fulford in September, on September 20th, 1066. They come up against the reigning Northumbrian earls, Edwin and Morcar, the people that Tosti did not like, and because of whom Tosti was sent into exile. And they win. These invading Scandinavian forces win the Battle of Fulford. Harold Godwinson is not going to stand for an uppity younger brother making mischief in his kingdom. And so we have Harold racing up to fight Harold Hardrada and Tosti in 1066, and that is the Battle of Stamford Bridge, just a little way over the river. This is where we have all the wonderful tales of the lone Norwegian axeman standing on the bridge and holding it against the the surging English forces until somebody then goes under the bridge and stabs him. It's all rather graphic. And if you go to Stamford Bridge, as you cross the bridge, there's a pub, and you'll find that their little illustration, their little plaque, is that lone Norwegian with his huge axe. September 25th, that's when the Battle of Stamford Bridge happens. And what we get here is the comprehensive defeat of the incoming Scandinavian army. Harold Hardrada and Tosti both lose their lives in this battle, and this is one of the reasons why you'll often see Harold Hardrada called the last Viking. He's given that sort of wonderful title, and it's because this is where he ends, but this is 1066 is also where traditionally the Viking Age ends. It's not the end of the story for Harold, however, because he has to race down to Hastings to face the invasion by William, who is also here to stake his claim on the throne of England. And we know what happens after that. We know the result of that particular skirmish, shall we say. So 1066 in many ways represents the end of the Viking Age in Britain. That's how it's traditionally been seen. But what we've seen here through all of the stuff, all of the very confusing stuff that I've taken you through, is that there's an interlinking between the people of Britain and Scandinavia from the lowest levels to the highest levels of power that was so complete and so complex that it's hard to pull them apart. Almost all of the actors in the events of 1066 have Scandinavian backgrounds and kinship connections to one another. Convoluted, of course, but they're there. And it's too far of a stretch to claim that these kinship relations were the reason why the events of 1066 took place. That's not what I'm saying here. But what is clear is that these individuals, they used these kinship connections and these interpersonal relationships to facilitate and to create opportunities for themselves to further their own ends, their own political ends, always in service of a grab for power. Whether it's trying to be Earl of Northumbria or whether it's trying to be the King of England, they're all grabbing for power, and they're using these kinship relations to make their claims. These relationships shape the political events leading up to 1066. And hopefully what it shows us is that in the 11th century, the personal certainly was political. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pragya. That was fantastic.